Phycology is the scientific study of algae. Algae are unique types of organisms. They're eukaryotic celled in structure. They can be single cell, unicellular, and those types of algae that are unicellular, tiny microscopic organisms, are often described as part of the group of protists, but more specifically, scientists describe them as phytoplankton. Plankton are the small, unicellular, microscopic eukaryotes that are found in the open ocean. Tiny little organisms that are part of the foundation of the food chain, or the food web here on Earth. And sometimes plankton are more specifically described as either zooplankton, meaning non-photosynthetic, or phytoplankton, referring to photosynthetic unicellular microorganisms. And so that's where we find many of the algae, in these tiny single-celled plankton populations out in the ocean. Not only are algae possibly unicellular, but they can be multicellular. In fact, they look very plant-like. But when we take a look at the intricate structures of the multicellular algae, what we do find is that there are no organized tissues or organs as we would expect to see in a plant. That's why algae have been placed into their own separate group. They are eukaryotic, so they're going to be in the domain Eukarya. And for the time being, we don't have any particular kingdom that we're going to place these organisms into, but they do have their own types of classification system further down the food chain with families and classes and orders. But we're going to look at a few specific species that have been important in the scientific study of microbiology, and more specifically microbial genetics. One type of algae that's been very important in science are the green algae, also called chlorophyta. A variety of different green algae have provided good models for studying cell function, photosynthesis, and these are the most plant-like of the organisms in the group algae. They use the same types of green photosynthetic pigments that are called chlorophylls that we find in higher plants, or more specifically grass, trees, other kinds of plants. And chlorophyll A and B are the primary photosynthetic pigments of both green algae and plants. Green algae can be found as unicellular and multicellular, and the specific genus that we're going to pick out to highlight is Acetabularia. The common name is the mermaid's wineglass. When we take a look at this photo in the lower right, when at first glance these do look very much like plants. But in fact, each individual stalk with its cap on top is a large single eukaryotic cell. Some of the largest eukaryotic photosynthetic cells that we can find on Earth. Diatoms. Diatoms are also certain types of algae. Diatoms are some of the prettiest types of algae, at least I think so, because they have a unique color that's a golden yellow. That's coloring, that's pigmentation, that's photosynthetic, that's a little bit different than what we find with the green algae. And that's why we call them golden or yellow-green algae, because of their unique yellow-green photosynthetic pigments. Now we have a couple of different examples of diatoms. Stephanodiscus, Stephanos meaning crown, and Asterianella, because it has sort of a star-like appearance. Stephanodiscus and Asterianella are commonly found in fresh water, especially in the cooler months of the year. That's when we see more diatoms in populations in freshwater ponds or freshwater sources of water or lakes. And Stephanodiscus specifically gives us a better idea of how diatoms are organized or structured. They are single-celled organisms. They can live in colonies, and that's what Asterianella is showing us. It's actually a cluster of those long, slender diatom cells. The Stephanodiscus on the top photo, if you take a close look, is actually an assembly of a top and a bottom. In fact, all diatoms have a top and a bottom, kind of like a petri dish, with a single-celled organism inside. The shell, or this outer covering, is made of silica. It's a glass-like structure, and so we might say that diatoms live in glass houses because of this two-part shell that protects the single cell that lives inside. This silica shell, or this glass-like shell, is an example of biomineralization that diatoms can perform. Diatoms have the ability to extract minerals from the surrounding aquatic environment and polymerize those minerals into visible structures like these silica shells that provide the casing or the protection for the single-celled organism inside. In addition to using them in sort of a source of food, as a part of the primary sources of food in the food web, diatoms also have an industrial application when we have big, huge piles of them that have accumulated at the bottom of water sources. And if you've ever seen old-fashioned polishes, sort of a somewhat grit-like polish, like old-fashioned silver polish, those are actually made up of diatom shells, because the shells survive even after the cell inside has died. So that biomineralization, that polymerization, or creating a structure that includes very, sort of gritty, sturdy minerals as part of those structures, can be very helpful for some of our industrial applications. Diatoms are also some of the Earth's most important sources of oxygen. A large percentage of the oxygen that you're breathing right now was produced by all of the abundant diatoms that are found all over the Earth. So, very important types of tiny single-celled organisms that produce these beautiful sort of three-dimensional shell-like structures that contain a lot of silica. Now, unfortunately, not all diatoms are just pretty helpful, useful. Most of them are. In fact, probably about 99% of all diatoms are very beneficial. But there's a small percentage with the right environmental conditions that can produce a neurotoxin called domoic acid. The occurrence of the production of domoic acid will occur when we have this combination of a particular species of diatom called Pseudonychia multiflora and the accompanying bacteria that live and can live on the diatom shells. When the environmental conditions are just right, the populations of Pseudonychia and the accompanying bacteria sort of bloom, or they overgrow. When they overgrow or populate an aquatic environment significantly, the one thing you'll notice is that the color of the water changes. It takes on more of this sort of yellow-greenish or golden appearance, almost as if it's kind of like the water was on fire, a yellow fire, and it's part of the phenomena that's described as red tide. Now, red tide we'll talk about again in another example, but here we have a diatom that can be part or responsible for, again, some of this, what we call harmful algal bloom, an overabundance of algae growing in an aquatic environment. When this happens, and we have this sort of symbiotic relationship between the bacteria and the diatom, leading to the diatom producing this neurotoxin, the neurotoxin gets into the water and can cause problems with nerve function in all kinds of mammals, including humans. We have what's called a toxic encephalopathy. the brain's just not able to work properly because of the interference due to this neurotoxin that can become ingested, become part of either something that might have gotten into your nose and mouth if you're swimming in the water, or maybe if you're possibly eating some of the fish or something that has been caught in this water. The symptoms of this toxic encephalopathy include gastroenteritis. So at first you think you possibly have a case of intestinal flu or maybe even food poisoning, but then the symptoms get more serious in nature because the toxin itself targets the hippocampus and the amygdala in the brain. These are structures buried deep within the brain that are part of the sort of the way station or the network of various intricate structures in nerve function, in brain function. There's damage to the olfactory pathway, so we have problems with the sense of smell. It will target certain areas in the brain that have to do with proper motor function. So you wind up with short-term memory loss along with loss of motor function with seizures, ataxia, difficulty walking or moving, even cardiac arrhythmias have occurred, sometimes coma, which means loss of consciousness, and in very rare cases, domoic acid neurotoxin encephalopathies can lead to death. And so this domoic acid intoxication is a problem that's been more noticed or sort of more recently become a problem as we see changes in water temperature in various parts of the world, because that is the key environmental trigger that enhances this interaction between the pseudonychia and the bacteria that lead to the diatom producing higher levels of domoic acid. Usually we have the domoic acid accumulating in sort of edible fish. As I mentioned, it's not usually that humans sort of swim in the water and get the domoic acid, but they ingest some kind of food like shellfish, sardines, or even anchovies in which the toxin has what we call bioaccumulated. Domoic acid bioaccumulation means a little fish had some domoic acid into their system, gotten it into their flesh. And then a bigger fish ate the little fish, and the next thing you know, we eat the bigger fish. The toxin itself continues to build up as it's passed along the food chain. As the toxin is ingested from smaller animals, then eaten by larger animals, the toxin stays intact, and the concentration simply increases more and more as it builds up in the flesh of the next population that ingests the primary source. Pseudonychia loses most of its ability to produce domoic acid if it's cultured what we call azenically. An azenic culture means that you have some type of organism, like a diatom, that you've managed to get bacteria-free. In other words, it's just the diatom and not its partner-associated bacteria. It's actually very difficult to find any kind of small single-celled organism in aquatic systems that don't have and live in a community with lots of other organisms living intimately with each other. Just like the photo of the scanning electron microscope image on the right shows you, the diatom is the larger sort of needle-shaped cell, and the tiny little dots that are attached to it almost looks like sort of, sort of little popcorn or Rice Krispies that are stuck to the surface of this needle-shaped long structure that's predominating in the photo. Those tiny little sort of Rice Krispie little structures are the bacteria that were going to live sort of intimately with the diatom, and somehow the chemical interaction between the two, depending upon, again, upon the temperature of the water and the concentration of the various bacteria, can change the metabolism of the diatom, leading to overproduction of the domoic acid toxin. Another group of algae are brown algae. The brown algae are called Phaeophyta. These organisms are very beneficial, and in fact, you might be using them as part of your diet because a common name for various types of brown algae are kelp. Nereocystis and Laminaria are excellent representative genera of brown algae. If you've ever heard of kelp forests, which are the photographs in the center of this slide, they're very large. They can grow up to roughly 10 meters or so, or even longer, and they grow rapidly. They're usually what we call annuals. They're going to develop from tiny little starting points at the beginning of a growth season, get tremendously large and long within 1 year, and then die, and then a whole new population starts to grow. And the kelp forests that we find all over the world are in oceanic or very large bodies out in the ocean, and it is like a forest. The kelp forests, the numerous kelp that are out there in the ocean, provide a whole ecosystem and place for all kinds of organisms to live. The kelp forests are vitally important for the health and well-being of all of our ocean-dwelling animals and even other plants, along with living with these algae. The dense forests are so thick that you can see these forests from satellite images, and historically in the Atlantic Ocean there's a dense kelp forest called the Sargasso Sea. Several hundred years ago, the population of kelp in the Sargasso Sea were so thick during especially the peak of growth of the kelp that sometimes it was difficult to get sailing ships through the forests themselves because of the dense growth of these large kelp. If you've ever seen these, they're beautiful to look at, and again, they're amazingly large structures that you would think would be plants, but if we take a close look at the intricate intracellular structures and organization of the kelp, they don't have the structure we expect to see for a plant. On the lower left, just as a reminder, if you've ever had sushi or sashimi and that sort of a dark forest green wrap that might be on the outside of the rice or the fish, that's kelp. And so it's a good source of food for all kinds of people and animals, and it's a great place in the ocean for lots of animals and other things to live. Dinoflagellates are another group of algae. They have unique kinds of photosynthetic pigments that are red in color. So again, very unusual types of organisms. Different color, you wouldn't think that something red could be photosynthetic, but remember how the colors of the leaves change in the fall. They're reds and yellows and different kinds of photosynthetic pigments that we can see or have visibility of because of the changing length of day and temperature, so that the pigments change in the leaves of the trees. Well, these are similar types of red pigments that we find in the dinoflagellates, but they just appear red all the time. They have an outer shell. The outer shell is a very sturdy structure that's often made with something that's almost indestructible called sporopollenin, or a sporopollenin-like material. Sporopollenin, scientists are studying this material even now, up until recently, couldn't even be destroyed or dissolved. Sporopollenin is that shell or cell wall material that often can be discovered in ancient archaeologic remains, or even paleontologists that are looking at materials that have been dug up from the earth from millions of years ago, and they're looking at pollen grains. The the shells of pollen grains are made of sporopollenin. So it's a very indestructible substance. You could even see the shells of ancient diatoms or dinoflagellates with the sporopollenin shells that they might have. And so a very interesting, unique kind of sturdy chemical that these organisms use for their shells. Now here is Serratium renapes. Serratium renapes has a very interesting ability to grow these little hand-like structures daily. They go through a tremendous transformation of growth in their life cycle. Let's see if we can get this to tell us about it.
Dinoflagellates. Single-celled protists equipped with two propelling flagella. Its unique shape is easily recognizable. Like other protists, Serratium transforms the sun's energy into food through photosynthesis. The cell and its chloroplast produce oxygen and convert carbon dioxide into organic compounds. Serratium are highly adaptable. At dawn, they grow fingers packed with chloroplasts to capture more light. When light vanishes, the fingers retract. Feature allows Serratium to sink in the dark or float to the surface to catch more light.
So that's an example of Serratium growing and changing its position in the water based on the structures, the little appendages. And except for the buffering issues of getting the video to run, it's a pretty fascinating adaptation that's pretty unique to that type of dinoflagellate. So interesting little single-celled organisms living inside of unique types of cell walls or shells. All good, part of the plankton that we find in the ocean and lots of aquatic environments. However, if they're growing in overabundance, then we have some problems. Because if we have harmful algal blooms of dinoflagellates, that's when we see more types of red tides. The red tides are typically associated with coastlines. And here we see these types of dinoflagellates, and there are actually several different species of dinoflagellates that can cause red tide, also produce toxins, unfortunately, as part of that overabundance, and again, probably with interactions of types of bacteria that are also blooming or overgrowing in particular aquatic environments. When we look at the coastlines where red tide is occurring, it does appear that the water is on fire because of the intense concentration of these red dinoflagellates. We do see sort of an orangish, reddish color accumulating in the water. You might have, if you've ever been to a coast or an area where red tide is occurring, you might have seen signs that say, do not go into the water, do not ingest any shellfish that are found in those areas in that water, associated with that water. And that's because, again, of bioaccumulation of the toxins that these dinoflagellates can produce. Now, one of the dinoflagellates that's a serious problem when ingesting fish that are found in areas where the red tide is occurring is Gambierdiscus toxicus. That's the name of the dinoflagellate. It's illustrated on the right in the photo. So it's a very sort of unassuming little sort of spherical shaped dinoflagellate, and not a problem as long as you're not going to ingest any fish or anything from an area where this organism has produced a bloom and unfortunately produces a toxin that gets ingested by the local fish, and then with bioaccumulation gets concentrated as it moves from one organism to another. The name of the toxin is ciguatoxin, and the condition that occurs is ciguatera fish poisoning if human beings ingest the fish that have bioaccumulated the ciguatoxin in their flesh. If you ingest what they call reef fish, or fish taken off the coastlines, especially on the East Coast, you're going to find that you have the typical gastric upset that's often associated with food poisoning, or what we might call stomach flu, of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. That's what the NVD stands for. Ataxia, difficulty with coordination and walking, paresthesia, some loss of sensation, numbness in hands or feet, arthralgias, pains in joints, myalgias, pains in muscles. And so again, you'd think perhaps you might have a case of the flu, or what we call an intestinal bug, but in fact it might be because you have ingested some ciguatoxin. Numbness can occur in all kinds of locations in the body, not just hands and feet, but there's sort of an interesting sort of random type of symptomology that accompanies ciguatoxin poisoning that makes it sometimes a little tricky for folks to initially pin down just what might have happened. The CDC identifies that ciguatoxin poisoning, or Ciguatera fish poisoning, is the most common foodborne illness due to fish consumption. We call it fin fish or reef fish consumption in the United States. So it's a little more common than most folks would imagine. If we take a look at the geographic distribution of where this Ciguatera fish poisoning occurs, notice it's in essentially primarily the equatorial and maybe a little bit of the temperate zone areas, pretty much all over the world. And again, primarily near coastlines. If we take a look in the Gulf of Mexico, high numbers of occurrences there. If we take a look at Southeast Asia, all along that area. So it can occur in various different places in the world, and some parts a little bit more predominantly than others, but just do be careful when you're in those parts of the world and if you're consuming fin fish, or what we call reef fish. Another type of organism that can cause red tide, and it's more associated with the East Coast here in Virginia and North Carolina, is Pfisteria piscicida. Pfisteria is first initially discovered off the coast of North Carolina really in the 1990s. It became a problem when we saw significant what are called fish kills. About 1993, I think, is when they really were noticeable. Thousands of fish started to die and were showing up on the shores along North Carolina, and it took scientists a little bit of time to figure out what was going on, because when they found the dead fish, they saw that the fish were all covered with these ulcerative lesions that you can see on the upper middle photo of the poor little fish that were recovered from these massive fish kills. With careful study, the scientists in various institutions in North Carolina did discover that it was a dinoflagellate, Pfiesteria piscicida was the first species identified, that was responsible for essentially causing these wounds, leading to sort of lethal or fatal wounds in the fish, resulting in this significant fish kill. And again, it was associated with an overabundance of this particular diatom. After a year or so, these diatoms continued to not only cause a problem off the coast of North Carolina, but headed north and also south. Within a year or so, we had problems here in Virginia in the Chesapeake Bay, even farther up in the Delaware Bay, and then also all the way along the length of the East Coast, and then even into the Gulf of Mexico. And so Pfiesteria has become a noticeable problem in the last 20 years or so. Another group of algae, which is the last group we're going to talk about, are the Rhodophyta, which are the red algae. To me, these are some of the most beautiful algae that can be studied. And sometimes it's just important for scientists just to be able to characterize and identify all the different types of organisms that we find here on Earth. And that's what some folks do. They study and learn about all the different types of algae, both beneficial and the few that are possibly harmful. But here we have some examples of algae that are very beneficial. Mozella splendens and Chondrus crispus are red algae that are sources of nutritional additives that we use very extensively, especially in dairy products. If you've ever purchased yogurt, ice creams, various types of dairy products of those sorts, even cottage cheese, take a look at the label and you'll probably see carrageenan is one of the ingredients that's been used in the manufacturing of that food. Carrageenan is kind of a sort of smoothing product. It gives the food a silky, smooth texture that people tend to like. And so these two different examples of red algae are sources of this chemical additive that gives food a texture that human beings prefer. A couple of additional red algae that are also beneficial, Gelidium and Gracilaria. Gelidium and Gracilaria produce agar. Agar is, again, that gel-like material, sort of like gelatin, but a very different kind of chemical structured material. So agar is used, of course, in bacteriology. We use agar to make the material, the food, solid food for our bacteria. Agar is used in cooking. And there are many cultures or many groups of folks around the world that use this gel-like material as we would use gelatin as a dessert. They add all kinds of flavorings to it and use that as a source of a treat or dessert. So Gracilaria and Gelidium, red algae that produce agar for bacteriology and cooking. Mozella splendens and Chondrus crispus that produce carrageenan that we use again as a nutritional additive for especially dairy products. All beneficial sources of substances for humans to use. In somewhat recent years, another source of agar was discovered in a completely different genus of red algae called Pterocladia lucida. It became a source of industry in New Zealand, and so that's another reason that scientists go all over the world and find and learn about these new kinds of organisms to see what kinds of, are there any substances or materials that we might find useful. Not to say that that's the only reason that you'd have to be searching for new organisms, but yes, indeed, That's sort of one of the outcomes of looking at the different products that Terra Claudia could produce or had available, is the fact that they found a new industrial manufacturing source for agar.